So, Rob, I just wanted to sort of kick things off by saying a big thank you for joining us today. I know listeners won't be privy to the absolute disastrous technical issues that we've had before recording, which are very much at my end, but you've been incredibly patient, and especially as a podcaster yourself, I appreciate you being so thoughtful in terms of my flapping around. It's great to connect with you. Great to have you on the show today. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure, Charlie. Yeah, I mean, it's because I've had my fair share of technical cock-ups myself. So, I mean, it's only fair that I can be patient with someone else.
Top man, that's very kind of you. Rob, we, as you well know, kind of having listened to the show before, format, we always like to kick things off by kind of really getting to know our guests and prying into their background a little. I know from meeting you before that you've got a particularly interesting kind of segue, if you like, to ultimately finding yourself doing what you're doing today at Native. But can you just take us back to kind of the beginning, if you like, specifically thinking about your career in sustainability and in ethical corporate practice? Some of our guests take us back to like literally, it was the lemonade stand at the age of 8 and everything from then on. But just pick a time to start with and just give us a bit of a sense of your narrative.
Yeah, sure. So I think where it kind of started for me is I had a massive spiritual awakening when I was 21. And essentially, I mean, without going into masses of detail, one of the kind of key takeaways is that I realized very clearly that like I was here to be of service, and that actually I wouldn't, my life wouldn't have any meaning and I wouldn't enjoy my life unless I could find a way of being of service. And that's partly tied up with being incredibly privileged as well. And having a really, really happy family and, parents who were very loving, and, just realizing that in the grand scheme of things, that's pretty rare. And that I was incredibly fortunate to have all that, and feeling kind of like, well, I therefore sort of like kind of owe it to the world and to humanity really to like share that fortune in some way and try and make other people's lives better. So that was kind of where it started.
Rob, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but that's, I mean, to have had that kind of awakening observation at the age of 21, that's a very young age to be kind of, to go through that sort of experience. We can cut this out if not, but can you give us like a little bit more detail on exactly what happened and how you came to realize that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I wasn't looking for it. I was at a music festival. I just had a really fun evening. I'd not really read into Buddhism. It was really not something that I was searching for. I wasn't on a kind of spiritual journey or anything. I wasn't doing loads of meditation. It was something that just happened all of a sudden. And in lots of different spiritual traditions, they'll say that sometimes this does happen, an act of grace. You get like a flash of awakening. And in my case, it was very deep and very profound. I was walking along a field. I felt a weight drop off my chest to the extent that I literally felt kind of weightless. And it felt like I was just kind of floating across the field. And everything I could see was just kind of like illuminated with this like internal kind of like golden light. It was extraordinary. And my mind completely stopped. I mean, the question that sort of like triggered it was this question of basically like, who am I? Like, who is I was like, oh, don't get big headed, basically, because I just had this really great evening. I was like, don't get sort of arrogant. And then the thought was like, who is the one feeling the arrogance? Do you know what I mean? Like almost like this, like, there's the sort of emotion or feeling of arrogance, but like, who is the I feeling the arrogance? Like this sort of duality just collapsed for a second and my mind just completely stopped. So it's very kind of like blissful and really like just this feeling of like, there's no more questions. But it took a long time to integrate it. And I was pretty confused afterwards and it was kind of difficult. But what kind of did come out of it really clearly was like, right, like I just need to be of service. Like I'm not going to be happy in any shape, way or form unless I can find a way of being of service. And so that's kind of guided my career ever since. And climate change has always been, I mean, even at school, I remember learning about climate change and going, well, this seems really important. And it just seems to be like a footnote in biology. And then like now we're just trotting off to learn algebra. And it's like, no, hang on a minute. That tiny little part of the curriculum, that feels massive. And so I just sort of wedded the two. And I mean, from there, I ended up actually speaking in schools a lot about climate change. I worked for the Green Schools Project. I did a lot of kind of inspiring young people to take action. That led to a year at a corporate sustainability think tank, which was sort of well intentioned, but I couldn't sort of work out how we were shifting the dial. Like we didn't seem to have much leverage, right, over companies. Seemed to be more like a sort of place for them to kind of talk about all the cool stuff they were doing, but without us really changing anything. Not to say that's the case for all think tanks, but just in this one. And then was very lucky, met my co-founder, one of our co-founders, Chris, who is from the Pacific Islands and has spent his life in climate. And he sort of had this half hatched idea that we've kind of developed into native.
Wow. And so, sorry, just to go back into some of those stages of your career. You're 21, you have this experience. Are you at university at the time? Did you and then just talk us through the kind of the early stage decision making that you made, in terms of joining the think tank, etc., the school work, etc. Like, how did that then, influence and affect your early career decision making?
Yeah, well, it took a while. I said I was teaching bridge for several years. It's not like it all kind of clicked. But I just knew in the back of my mind that I was this thing of being of service was going to be core to everything. And then it's about, isn't it? It's about marrying your gifts with the things that you really care about. And I've got some people say I'm quite good at talking, quite good at kind of motivational speaking and like facilitating. So that led into schools. And then I think kind of got to the point where I could see, it's intensely meaningful working in schools with young people every day and talking about issues and climate change and what young people can do, and really sharing that message that young people can actually change the world, which we saw very clearly, right, from Greta Thunberg and the whole, schools strike for climate. So that was intensely rewarding, and I was also sure that I was doing a lot of good, but it was. You don't see the impact because obviously they're young, so hopefully they'll grow up and they'll start changing the way they live and their career choices, etc. But you don't get to see any of that. And I think more than anything, I could just see where that could go. As in, I thought, okay, if I really pursue this, I can kind of see the peak of the mountain that I could climb of education and the role that can play. And my nature is to kind of always want to try something different. So then I was like, right, well, I wonder how much good you can do in the corporate world. And so where are the leverage points there? Like where is the kind of point where we can have the most impact in the corporate world? And that kind of led to this think tank. Again, as I say, wasn't convinced that was a particularly strong leverage point. But I think that's the beauty of kind of nature markets and carbon markets, is that actually pound for pound, if done ethically and with integrity, they can be insanely effective. This is about taking money from where it is, which is basically corporate marketing budgets, where there's a lot of money. Companies do care about their reputation, and we can use that, to the places in the world that are actually the most precious and biodiverse ecosystems, which are basically they're keeping our future alive. These places, like that. If it isn't for these last remaining biodiverse places, the future of humanity looks exceptionally bleak. And they are chronically underfunded. / they actually have plenty of funds available to destroy and degrade them, and almost none to prop them up without this kind of intervention. So that seemed to me like a very, very, very powerful kind of leverage point, not to sort of fight the system, but to use the way the system works, right? Like, companies care about their reputation. Individuals care about their reputation. Companies care about their reputation. We need to use this, we need to design the system in such a way that actually becomes a force for change, right? And it totally can be. And that's actually why I think what you guys are doing is so important, because you're making sure that, organizations that are doing good can have reputational benefits, but the ones that can't. That's super important, right? Humans have evolved. The reason why we're so good at cooperating across scales is because we have language. So actually, if Charlie has, actually been a really selfish, poor community member, and he's just nicked all the food but not provided any, we can all say, Charlie's a bit of an asshole. Don't give him any dinner tomorrow, and you won't get anywhere in our community, right? That's literally why gossip evolved, right? And social media is this kind of hyper crazy extension of that, which is not designed very well. But, corporate marketing is all tapping into that place, right? It's all basically like the whole kind of CSR thing is all like, we are doing good for the planet, so therefore we should have a good reputation. You should pay more for our goods. Employees want to work for us. And when it's working well, it's an incredibly elegant system for making sure that basically, as Abraham Maslow said, the definition of a good society is one in which virtue pays.
Rob, I've got two questions, which, and by the way, that was super interesting. And I love how you've segued and touched upon the nature of the work that you're doing at Native, which we will definitely come back to. Question for you regarding being an entrepreneur. Did you always know, kind of from your early days, that was ultimately where you were headed to found something like this, or was it something that evolved over time and was born out of that frustration that you were having at the think tank, that you thought, right, I've actually got to go ahead and really do something here? Like, just talk us about your kind of entrepreneurial journey, if you like.
Absolutely didn't know I was always going to do that. I'm not someone who plans kind of 5-10 years in advance, because I think you start to miss opportunities if you have too much of a clear idea of where I want to go. Certainly in my case anyway. So this was more just something that came out of a real affinity that I had with Chris, one of the other founders, who had this there was a previous iteration of Native called Beach Collective, which is still working. It involved a currency which funds beach cleans and mangrove restoration every time you use it, and a kind of social platform. But essentially it just came from this total eye-to-eye understanding of some of the key drivers of why actually we're giving reputation, status, and also money to things that actually we don't value. Like, collectively, humans, if you ask people if they value mangrove restoration or they value rainforests, they'll say yes, absolutely. But the way our money is designed doesn't reflect that, right? Like, money is being poured into all sorts of stuff that we don't value and actively don't want to happen. Partly because of poor design of the currency. And the same thing happened with social media, right? Like, social media is can be this place which is really about shining a light on important, valuable stuff, but actually it's degraded into like who can shout the loudest and throw the most crap. But essentially, we just agreed 100% on those two things, and that these were very, very powerful leverage points. There's nothing that humans care about more than our reputation and our wallet, right? So if we can design them with that Abraham Maslow quote in mind, that the definition of a good society is one in which virtue pays, you can unleash phenomenal amounts of good, basically, because we have this within us, right? Humans, I do believe, fundamentally, like we are good at a very fundamental level. We have light and dark within us, obviously, but actually, like, we're fundamentally cooperative, we're fundamentally creative, we are drawn to the good, but we're kind of fighting against ourselves because we design systems which keep rewarding all the kind of selfish, short-term, greedy aspects of ourselves, which are there, but we're almost like inviting the worst parts of ourselves out to play more than we need to. And we just kind of agreed 100% on that. And it's, in a way, it's quite like a redemptive sort of way of looking at things, because it basically says, there's so much chat about how kind of evil and stupid and like how bad we are. And like, we're destroying each other, we're destroying everything. And it's like, without overlooking that, because there's a lot that humanity, we really need to grow up. It also says, like, we're kind of also victims of our context. Like, the whole thing about humanity is that we're insanely adaptable. That's why we're so successful. So if you create conditions which reward a certain type of behavior, we will adapt to that. You will see more of that behavior. And so it's almost like saying, don't worry, we're not all terrible and awful. It's just we're living in systems which really reward those parts of ourselves. And actually, rather than finger wagging and blaming each other and feeling kind of terrible and guilty all the time, let's put our energy and attention in designing contexts where actually the best of humanity we won't have to wag our finger at people in order to bring it out. It'll just be the adaptive strategy. It'll be the thing that naturally, the cream will naturally rise to the crop, because that's what's being rewarded and incentivized by the context we've designed.
Rob, that was absolutely brilliant. That was such a, I just sign me up. Whatever there is to sign up to, I'm backing you. That was, honestly, that was brilliant. Do you ever feel a little bit like, and I think I know you're going to respond to this, but do you ever feel with what you're doing with native that you're the sort of the Robin Hood, if you like, figure, and that there's a degree of, there's a system in place which essentially, as you've alluded to, rewards brands that position themselves in a certain way, and that you're facilitating realizing that outcome through a very kind of effective mechanism, if you like, but ultimately you're still playing the original game?
Yes, to a certain extent, yeah. I mean, in this case, it's really about, a large focus behind what we're doing. It's in the name, right? Native, is that we're trying to actually reward the indigenous communities who are basically keeping our future alive. Um, so often, these communities, their only form of income, the only way they can pay for medical centers, clean running water, all of this kind of stuff, not to mention the resources they need to kind of stave off threats of logging, illegal or otherwise, is their natural resources. Like that is the only route they have to kind of participating in the market economy. And so they're often faced with this really stark choice, which is like either we have to kind of like to chop down or sell some of it in order to basically not live in poverty. And that's a really kind of stark choice. And obviously their whole way of looking at the world is that these places have an identity, right? Like the forest, the trees, like they have an identity. They have a personality, they have names, they have a deep spiritual relationship and connection with these places. So that's the last thing they want to do. And indigenous communities are, as is shown, more effective at protecting nature than national parks, right? So it's just deeply unfair that they're basically doing this work on behalf of all of us, and yet often they can't afford like medicine. Do you know what I mean? It's like that's deeply unfair. And actually, these communities don't want to own like Ferraris, right? They just need kind of like their basic needs met and to be able to like live in dignity in the modern market economy, and also be able to keep their cultures like really intact and thriving. Because the whole reason why they've been so effective at protecting these places is because their cultures have evolved over thousands and thousands of years, and they've worked out what works like in the long term, not in a short term kind of boom and bust sort of way, but in a kind of long term reciprocal like relationship with nature. And so their traditions and values and their cultures are incredibly effective at staying the course. Like evolution has proved that beyond doubt. And so that's also a big focus, is that you need to kind of keep these traditions and communities and cultures really intact and thriving. And to a certain extent, that does need economic resources, right? So it's you said kind of gave the Robin Hood example. I don't think about it like that, but like yes, essentially, it's taking money from where there's lots of it, called marketing budgets, and it's putting it to where it really needs to go for all of us. Like all of us, we need more money to go into these communities and into these places.
Crucially, coming back to your point about system changes, is that to facilitate that, Native is offering a change of system to provide that input into those local into those indigenous communities via a smoother medium, if you like, than there has been before. And again, we've touched upon Native. I think, Rob, actually, for context of this conversation, it might be useful just to give like a really simple breakdown as to the exact nature of what you guys are doing.
Yeah, sure. So Native helps you protect and restore nature using a map-based geospatial model that evaluates carbon, biodiversity, and community impact in conservation and regeneration projects. So in plain English, we essentially help individuals or companies protect and restore nature. Our unit is not a ton of carbon or a biodiversity credit. The smallest unit is an area. It's a 3-meter square. And that's roughly the width of the human arm span. It's literally this by that, right? And which is quite nice visually. It's like everything you can hold within your arms. That's a very small unit, so the price is affordable. You can tack it onto most kind of consumer goods. Like it's about $3 for a 3-meter square of rainforest at the moment. And then the beauty of that is that it's tangible and it's real, and people can imagine it. I mean, the whole kind of problem, in my view, of carbon markets and nature markets, biodiversity markets at the moment is that if we are appealing to people's marketing budgets, right, to companies' marketing budgets, it's the voluntary carbon market for a reason, right? then it needs to be good. These interventions need to be good at engaging people. Companies need to be able to engage their employees. They need to be able to engage their investors, and they need to be able to engage their consumers, their clients, right? And one thing that people really don't care about is a ton of odorless gas. Like, it's so deeply uninspiring. It's like the most left brain way of trying to protect nature, which is this beautiful, complex, biodiverse, vibrant thing, with all these kind of symbiotic relationships going on. That's what rainforest is. That's what mangroves is. And to reduce it to this like abstract metric, which I can't see or smell or touch, is like, it is the most classic kind of left brain way of coming at this. And it's sort of really indicative of our whole civilization that we think that's the smart way to come at this. Whereas actually a square of rainforest, I can picture it, I can visualize it, I can even hear it, and that evokes wonder and inspires action. So it's way more effective for companies to be buying squares, which they can point to on a map, and their consumers, their clients, their investors can look at on a map. And then we'll give you all the data for carbon, for biodiversity, and for community impact. That's the third thing. So you can do with that what you want. Like if you want to use that as an offset, that's okay. If you want to put that in your reporting, that's fine. We'll even help you with kind of content coming out of these places, media, videos. We'll give companies exactly what they need, but it needs to be able to engage the people that they care about. And I think that's a better way of doing it.
Oh, Rob, it's honestly, and I have to say, I think I mentioned to you before we started the call that I jumped on the new native website, which again, give me the domain name so we can give it its first plug of the show.
It's nativesquared.com, native squared with a D at the end.com.
Nativesquared.com. I would recommend that anyone that's listening to the show right now, just go and check out the website. It is in terms of what Rob's just described, in terms of the positioning of, I guess, the impact. And I would say, in addition to what you've just said there, Rob, about thinking about that 3 meter sort of bit of land, you mentioned it. It's about also seeing the people that are ultimately engaging with that land, and the fact that yes, it is a 3 meter piece of land, but actually it's the human beings that are connected to that and experiencing that and looking after that and benefiting from that comes across really nicely. I think when you go on your website, there isn't a whiff of odorless gas on there. It's very much a sense of you say the biodiversity, the people, etc., associated with it. It's a thing of beauty, that website. Let me ask you, we've jumped around a bit here, Rob, and it's classic me for just not really having a full structure in place for this conversation. But let me ask you, just finishing on you, if you think about you've talked really openly and brilliantly about this sense of service, that was sort of derived from that experience that you had when you were 21. When you get to the end of your career and you look back, what would have been a successful career in your mind?
Gosh, that's a really big question. And I don't know. I think I hesitate because I feel like if I define too clearly what success is now, then it'll all be a bit too linear, and I might I shut myself off from that goal evolving over time, right? As in, I can tell you what my goal is now, is to try and protect and restore as much of the planet as possible. So that's my goal right now, and so I suppose I could say a successful career would be I achieved that, right? But I'm sure that my goals will change, and I think that's really healthy, right? Like the breadcrumb trail of what I find most meaningful it's going to change over time. But I only need to be able to see this far in front of me, and then when I get there, I'll be able to see that far ahead.
You alluded to it before in terms of not coming up with 5-year plans, etc. And I think that seems really sensible and is a very good way of we don't need to get ahead. We need to just focus on what's the immediate, and especially when you're considering such a huge objective and goal for what you're trying to achieve at Native, it's probably not needing to go beyond that.
Out of interest, do you have an idea of, like, looking back on your career, what will be a success?
God, now you've turned it. Now you've thrown it at me, Rob.
I mean, some people do, right? I by the way, everything I said so far, I was talking about, this is how I feel, like being of service. It's not that I think that everyone has to go out and be of service. I mean, I think it will tend to lead to a meaningful life, but there's other ways to pursue a meaningful life, right? And I think it's the same with this. Like, some people actually just do know, oh, I actually want to be a consultant radiologist, and that's absolutely fine, right? So it's not to, like, poo-poo anyone who does have a really clear idea. It's just for me, I've never had that, and I'm just curious if you have.
I think the thing for I think to answer the question, yeah, from my perspective, I love what I do in the sense of being creative and thinking about problems and trying to come up with creative solutions. I absolutely love that. I love that working in the context of greenwashing at the moment. I obviously am a marketeer, a comms guy by kind of trade, if you like. But that experience of coming up with creative solutions to problems is something that I'm essentially addicted to. And I think I would like to see my career play out that, I'd love to be one of these guys that never stops with that. And even if I'm, later in life, I'm working and mentoring, younger people, or if I'm working on something still, I'd love to still be engaged in that process, because I think there's a real thrill in creative problem solving. So I think that's where I see myself.
Because essentially those two things, cooperation, being a service, cooperation, creativity, those are, first of all, those are two buckets of things that, generally speaking, cross-culturally, everyone seems to find really meaningful, those two things. They're also, by the way, they're really, really excellent ways of describing the evolutionary process. Like, actually what the evolutionary process tends to do is it gets more and more cooperative over larger and larger scales, and it gets more and more creative and adaptable as it goes. Like, evolution actually gathers pace, like in a spiral. And I actually made a whole podcast on this exact topic, that those two things, that basically when we do what we find meaningful, we actually become like vehicles for the evolutionary process to like evolve through us and to carry on its way. Anyway, just as an aside.
No, Rob, I love it. Like, we've got to plug that as well. Where can listeners check out that podcast?
consciousevolution.co.uk.
Perfect. Thank you, Rob. Well, I myself are going to go and have a good old listen to that after, so thank you for that. Classically, Rob, and I said I would do this, I've got far too interested in the kind of getting to know you, and kind of got the timelines have gone slightly out the window in terms of the episode. But let's move on if we can. We shared with you an article from the World Future Energy Summit before the show. Would you mind just providing a brief summary for our listeners as to what that article covers, and then crucially kind of pick out from your perspective any of the kind of most salient, most interesting points that you'd like us to reflect on together?
Yeah, sure. So I think that the first point is that carbon markets, nature markets, biodiversity markets, these things have enormous potential to do good and to channel money from where it is to where it needs to go. So that we've discussed. I thoroughly agree with them on that. They cite a couple of predictions from Bloomberg, for example, which says it's going to, 150x or 200x over the next sort of 10 years, which I believe is true. They also go into quite a lot of detail about the fact that in the last year, there's been a real kind of crisis in nature markets. And a lot of that was triggered by the sort of Guardian investigation into Vera, which essentially was saying that they were overestimating risks to forests. So that's absolutely true. There's been a real kind of skepticism from a lot of buyers, and a lot of caution as buyers are worried about being accused of greenwashing, which has led to a fall away in demand and then a collapse in the price of carbon credits. It then proposes as a solution to that basically what we need is a lot more regulation and a lot better data and a lot more kind of granular data and understanding of additionality, and a lot more thoroughness and a lot more consensus about the way we go about things. To a certain extent, I think that is true and that is needed, but basically that's slightly like trying to solve our problems with the same level of thinking that created them in the first place. It's a little bit deck chairs on the Titanic. I mean, we don't need more data to know that we need to protect rainforests and to restore mangroves and to look after seagrasses and coral reefs. We don't need more data to work that out. And the issue really is a bit deeper than that, and it goes slightly back to that point that I made of reducing nature to single kind of messiah metrics like carbon. As soon as you make that decision, and as soon as you pursue this route of like, we need to know exactly that a ton of carbon has been offset, so that so that a company can call themselves carbon neutral. If that is the only focus, then several things happen. The first thing that happens is that nature is already immediately undervalued, right? Because if I suck a ton of carbon out of the air with a machine, I can't call that equal to a ton of carbon in a primary rainforest. It's just not. Like, we know for a fact that like the rainforest is doing so much more in the ecosystem and to the water system, for biodiversity, for communities, than the ton of carbon sucked out the air by a machine. So number one, however much we try and say, oh, these are plus plus, like these have all these co-benefits, we're still kind of comparing apples and oranges and trying to call them the same thing. We're trying to create this standard unit, which I think is I get why people are trying to do that, because they think that market forces are the only thing that's going to solve it. But this is not a market, this is marketing. Okay. And I think if we get that clear, then we don't have to kind of reduce nature to these single metrics. So just by definition, however much data we have, that will end up undervaluing nature and overvaluing technology-based reductions. It'll also end up undervaluing the role of indigenous communities, because they don't show up on the carbon balance sheet, but actually they're incredibly important for preserving nature. So that's number one. Number two is around this issue of additionality. So Verra were panned basically for overestimating the additionality of these projects. So just for listeners who aren't like super au fait with carbon markets, basically, if I'm going to use existing forest, not restoring degraded forest, but existing primary forest as an offset, then I need to prove that my intervention has prevented that carbon from being lost. I need to say that unless we had come along and bought these credits and financed this project, then the trees would have been chopped down, the carbon would have been lost, right? Which means I need to prove that there's a threat to the forest. So Verra have basically been panned because they were saying that there was more threat to the forest than there actually was. They were saying a lot of this is going to get lost, and actually, all this carbon is therefore additional, but actually, the reality is maybe they over exaggerated the threat.
How did they? So, Rob, so sorry to interrupt you, but how did they go about deducing what the threat was? Like, what was their methodology for establishing that?
Well, generally you use counterfactuals. So you take another similar type ecosystem and you say, well, look what happens at this over time. This has all been chopped down because we've done nothing. But you can obviously cherry pick the site. So, I mean, there's an incentive to like pick the site where like there's been the most deforestation and say, look, if we did nothing, this would happen. But Verra are the ones picking the site, and they're also the ones who are verifying the credit. So there's this like all these incentives are misaligned, right? You've got the wrong actors doing their judgment.
Again, coming back to the systems at play being ultimately geared towards promoting a certain behavior that ultimately doesn't suit the whole ethos of what we're trying to achieve. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's all right. And like, I have quite a lot of sympathy for the Verra guys. I don't think they're like evil, cynical players. I think they're just operating with misaligned incentives. Like, of course, they want to unleash as much money as possible for the forests. So, and that's why they got into this in the first place. So it's like, of course, it's tempting to over exaggerate the threat. But like I say, the problem is not that like, we need a whole load more data. In the end, if you're trying to predict what will happen to forest in the future if we do nothing, that's always a future scenario. You're always having to make a load of guesswork. And so, and that only comes out of this need to like have an exact carbon offset figure that we can be clear about. So I just think like we need to rethink that whole thing. And rather than trying to, I mean, just one more thing on that. Like we like additionality by its nature, it means that people are incentivized not just to exaggerate the threats, but sometimes to actually manufacture them. So let's take the example of an indigenous community that have actually done a really good job of protecting their forest, and they protected it really carefully. Maybe the government's even put in place legal protection. They've managed to fend off all the loggers despite all the economic pressure. And then someone like Verra would have to come along and say, yeah, you've protected the forest so well, there's no additionality here. So even if we don't give you any money, the forest will stay standing. So therefore, these communities can't monetize, but actually we're penalizing the people who've done the best job of protecting nature. And the ones that have actually flirted a bit with the logging companies and maybe they've chopped down some of the forest, they can go, yes, there's definitely a clear threat here. So then they get a load of money. So it's all completely backwards. And this is
Again,
why I say,
systems incentivizing the wrong behavior.
exactly. And this is why I say, like, it's not, we can, all the data in the world is not going to solve that problem. We need to rethink the entire approach, and we need to stop valuing nature for its carbon alone. And we need to think in a much more holistic way about additionality. And we need to think in a much more holistic way about what nature is and what it does. And stop, maybe, I mean, I understand that there's this, this whole thing of net zero and carbon offsets has got a lot of traction. And, to clarify, you can use native squares for offsets. But I think if that's where the conversation begins and ends, then all of these kind of unintended consequences flow from that. Overvaluing technology, undervaluing nature, undervaluing indigenous communities, and basically incentivizing people to create, manufacture, or exaggerate threats. This is all the wrong way of coming at this, and we don't have to come at it like that. There's plenty of other ways of doing it.
Rob, in light of that, because I now actually feel kind of that we've essentially shared an article with you that essentially pinpoints, if you like, some of the fundamental problems at play that Native is ultimately trying to resolve, which I think I'm actually quite pleased with ourselves that we've managed to propose such a piece. When you're describing there that boiling it just down to an offset is not the right way of looking at this, what is the right attitude for a corporate that's potentially looking at, offsetting, is looking at what they do about their carbon related issues? Like, what is the mindset that they should have when looking to provide, work with a third party that can help them in the way that Native can?
Well, there's a lot of talk about kind of contribution mindset instead of compensation mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, look, even if a company can calculate their emissions perfectly and then offset them, 1-to-1, there's a time issue there as well, right? Because the damage is done then, and then they offset it later, and you can't ever account for the impact those emissions have had in the middle time, right? And so there's just, I mean, I could go on and on, right? There's just sort of a million problems with doing that. Now, like, again, I'm not to say that you can't use native squares as an offset. It's just to say that I think rather than trying to think about like my impact, my negative impact, and my positive impact is this linear kind of bar that goes left or right, like a kind of 90s arcade game. It's not. Like, our impacts on the planet are non-linear, complex, and difficult to model. And if we kind of give up on this chimera of trying to measure everything down to the nth degree with a level of precision that corporates tend to demand, then it frees ourselves up to do much more impactful, but actually much more creative like campaigns. Imagine a company which comes along and says, look, we know roughly what our impact is. We've done a bit of measuring. We've tried to reduce these where we can. But rather than trying to be like perfectly neutral, what we've done is we've protected this huge area of rainforest. It's got these incredible stories behind it. We've got this great relationship with the communities. We protected all this biodiversity. Here's this rare bird that is actually part of our, campaign. And and also, by the way, every time you buy our product, we'll protect a square of rainforest in your name, and you can look at it. None of that requires this kind of linear, black or white sort of really kind of like two-dimensional thinking, right? It still gives companies what they want, which is they get to have impact, be clear about what that impact is and where it's taking place, and get the data, but also to engage the people they need to engage. So it gives them everything they need, right? But it doesn't fall into this trap of just valuing nature for a single metric.
And ultimately comes back to one of the phrases that you used earlier, where you referred to it, it's about marketing, not markets. And ultimately, It's about creating that bigger, broader story that goes beyond just the in and the out, the purely, carbon metric focused way of looking at a carbon offsetting. Rob, go on.
No, just one more thing. Like the tricky bit about this is that I do understand the intention behind designing a market, right? What they're trying to do is create market efficiency, right? They're trying to, by designing a market with supply and demand of carbon, it's trying to kind of make sure that the most efficient way of reducing carbon gains the most money because it will be the cheapest. And there is a certain logic in there. And I also do understand this, which this article points to, there is a certain amount of need to standardize, because unfortunately there are a load of cowboys out there which are selling snake oil. And so I do understand the impulse behind all these kind of ways of looking at it, and there's a lot of truth in them. It's just that I think there's smarter ways of creating the transparency and certainty that we need. And I think that area-based thing is perhaps the solution, because guess what? If the trees aren't there, then you will tell us. Like satellite imaging can point to the trees, and we get like the availability of data, biodiversity data, carbon data. This market is just accelerating so quickly. The people who can put microphones in the middle of the forest and they'll listen to a soundscape and tell you how rich the biodiversity is. I heard about something the other day there. Well, just gather a tiny bit of water from the local stream, and it will be able to capture all the DNA that's in the water, which basically tells you how vibrant the ecosystem is. So there's so many cool ways we can do of like gathering the data and all the rest of it. But I think there's ways of doing it which don't require they don't require this kind of really linear kind of like offsetting way of looking at things.
Rob, would it be really oversimplistic of me to sort of summarize then that essentially we need the carbon markets are there as as you say, as a logical step that will likely always have a part to play, and that needs tighter regulation in order to ensure that essentially it's managed and run appropriately. The data side of things will take care of itself essentially through just the evolutions and the technological advances that are just occurring as we speak, as you've alluded to. We haven't even touched upon the impact of AI and machine learning likely to have as well. And then the third element is that we need some that are starting to view this differently, to really view like the bigger picture, the bigger story, if you like, that can be created by going beyond that linear approach, as you've alluded to, and actually think about the wider implications of this and how you can create an even more compelling story and marketing piece around your contribution as a corporate entity. Would that be a fair summary?
I think that's a very fair summary. I mean, we would like to see the whole space move to be a bit more holistic. But I don't want to trash all the good work done in carbon markets so far, right? I always scoff at kind of technology-based reductions and cook stove projects and stuff like that, because I think, frankly, there's a lot of I won't go into all that, but even those, it's not to say that they can't be doing good, right? They can all be part of the solution, but particularly where it comes to nature, we need a more holistic way of thinking about it, or we're going to create a whole load of unintended consequences, and we're going to undervalue the things that are really most valuable.
I love that, Rob. I feel like that's a really good moment to kind of end that part of our conversation. We always try and sort of crescendo every episode, and I think you've already touched upon a number of really interesting, opinions and assertions that you've had regarding what needs to happen next on a macro scale. But if we were to ask the question, you were given a magic wand and you could change one thing about the corporate world as it is right now, what would that one thing be?
So I was speaking to somebody really wise on Sunday, and actually I asked them that just about life in general, right? And he said that there's really only one law, and that is to live with integrity. All the other laws and rules are kind of just there for other people to foist what they want on you. But I think, in the corporate world, you'd certainly see companies and individuals acting with integrity, but far too often that integrity is not there. And this is not for me or for anyone else to say how one should live or what one should do. It's about being in line with what you think is important, what you think is meaningful. And we're very good at rationalizing and making excuses for ourselves, particularly where our wallet is concerned, to allow us to act in ways that deep down we just know aren't right. And so I think a lot more people just staying true to what they actually think is meaningful and what they think is valuable as much as possible, because this isn't easy to align these two things all the time, particularly where money is concerned and where markets is concerned. But just that constant checking in with yourself and being like, do I believe in what I'm doing? Is this in line with my values? I think if people did that more often, then that would make a huge difference.
Do you think that there's a role to be played there when thinking about sort of the role of integrity, that's where the transparency becomes even more important, because we almost need to be able to engage in an understandable dialogue with one another about, well, what do you think is an approach that aligns with integrity? We need to understand that in order for us to be able to critique, in order for us to be able to, confirm, if you like, or to collaborate in that way. Coming back to some of what you've described in terms of language, is that a crucial aspect as well, integrity with transparency?
Yeah, I mean, transparency is all about, as you say, that reputation piece. It's about making sure that bad faith actors get found out and punished, and good faith actors get found out and rewarded, right? I think the point I was making about integrity is it's a little bit more internal. Of course, the two relate to each other and they affect each other. But it's really, for me, that's about people asking deeply of themselves, like, what is it that I most love and value? What are my gifts? What are my responsibilities? And kind of like asking that of themselves. And that's, no one else can give you answers to those questions, right? And yes, transparency and your reputation sort of might dovetail with that. But I think these questions are deeper than that. And it's really questions for everyone to ask of themselves, and then to try as much as possible in their careers to live in line with the answers to those questions. And also the beauty of that is that they'll have a really rich and meaningful life as well, and they'll probably be happier. So it's it's a win-win.
What a brilliant way to end. Rob, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been it's been a really genuinely energizing conversation. I know that we've spoken about possible opportunities for us to be able to partner up with Native. I think understanding the nature of what you're doing in a bit more depth and detail, I think it sounds like fantastic work. It sounds like really impactful work. And I'm just delighted that we've managed to get you on to share your thoughts on it, and obviously the broader issues at play. So thank you very much for joining us today. Hopefully you've enjoyed the experience. We might snaffle you for another episode at some point in the future.
My pleasure, Charlie. And just to say likewise, it's absolutely echoed. I think like that issue that you're working on, which is, as you say, on the transparency and basically, making sure that reputation and gossip is doing the job it's supposed to do. I think that's incredibly important. And it is another one of these leverage points. And so if we can get that right, companies will just start behaving because it's in their interest to do so. And that's what we all want.
Brilliant stuff. Thanks, Rob.